Thank you so much for joining us today, Jen. It's great to see you for our ESG Investment Influencers series. I wanted to start by really asking you about what's driven your passion for sustainable and ESG investing during your career, and which areas really interest you.
Sure. Well, actually, I've only really had the opportunity to be involved in ESG very recently, but I have been drawn to it for quite a while. And I guess it's because I've always been interested in science and geography. And for me, ESG is really about bringing the human element into investing that I really like. And I think it makes what is perceived as a technical, mathematical role much more accessible to the general public. So when I joined Liontrust last November, I really jumped at the chance to work on our multi-asset ESG process. And funnily enough, my friends and family are much more interested in what I do now. And I guess this is because I'm getting involved in real life, relatable issues that people outside the industry care about.
Yes, I think that has been the big change recently, hasn't it? That it's these issues are way out of the sphere of investment, as it were, and it's the global issues that everyone's talking about, and that's been the big change there. Well, where do you think the investment industry is on this journey to ESG becoming mainstream? You know, we're hearing a lot about it, but well, where are we on this journey?
I think the recognition is certainly there now, as you say. And I think many PMs are now viewing ESG as another extension of business risk. But of course, with the popularity of ESG investing, we're a lot more aware of non-financial things like supply chains and employee satisfaction, for example. And I guess it's quite a mammoth task of working out how to quantify and judge the relevancy of this information in your assessment, how to build a framework around it, and where it's actually prioritised in your investment process. So the fund houses that we deal with are at different stages with formally integrating. I mean, there are some that are just starting out, whilst others have had a kind of revolution in their approach, and it seems to be mainly over the last couple of years.
Yes, and I wanted to ask you, maybe you could explain briefly how you're integrating ESG considerations into your investment process on the Liontrust multi-asset portfolio range. What have you been doing there? What's been key to the development you've made?
Sure. So we started out by sending out questionnaires to all of the fund houses we deal with. And we've got two sets of questions, one for the asset house and then one for the funds themselves with a bit of a tweak around asset classes. You know, you don't vote on fixed income, for example. So at firm level, we're asking about ESG policies, so the governance side, basically. And then at fund level, we're interested in what the manager is doing, what resources they have, how does ESG actually fit into their process? I mean, hopefully it's more than a tick box at the end. So I've been trying to keep these questionnaires quite light, just to give me a little bit of information before we meet to discuss. And then we have annual process calls at firm and fund level. And this is where the bulk of our assessment comes from. So we're looking at how managers are implementing ESG and why are they doing it in this way? Why are certain issues a priority and more important to them? And then on top of these calls, our analysts are catching up with PMs twice a year anyway as part of their normal due diligence, and specific ESG examples are covered again here. And then other things we're doing. So like the other Liontrust teams, we've got a formal voting process now. This is really helpful. We're learning a lot from this. And this has actually inspired us to start doing our own governance work on the investment trust side. So here we'll be looking at things like director remuneration, for example, and exploring whether this really is best practice or generally just accepted. So quite a few different angles, but of course it's an evolving process. And even though I haven't been doing it for long, I do feel like we've covered quite a lot in the last 5 months. There's a lot of infrastructure in place at Liontrust already to help, so it's been really good.
What have been some of the challenges you faced when trying to get this information from groups? What have been some of the issues that you've had to try and get around?
Well, everybody's been very free with their information, actually, even the fund houses who are at the beginning of their evolution. But I think for me, the main challenge was that it was going from not having much knowledge on ESG to suddenly being all consumed with how we're going to make it part of our process. But to be fair, once I got started on the calls with the fund managers, it was definitely less overwhelming as it's so collaborative. Actually thinking about it, probably putting it all together is my biggest challenge. And I guess other multi-managers can relate to this, because at the end of the day, we are running multi-asset funds which need to be diversified and keep to a particular risk target. And ultimately, we don't buy and sell our own securities, so don't have control. But I think we can gain a good understanding of how our managers factor in ESG, just in the same depth we've got to know their investment processes and style over the years.
And what about ratings in this area? Do you use any? Do you value any? How does that sort of come into the process?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So we use MSCI ESG Manager. Now, we don't rely on it, of course, but it does offer a talking point, especially for those companies that have been downgraded recently. I guess you got the picture that our process is largely qualitative. So we do factor in these MSCI ratings. We also have a look at the funds on the ESG modules and Morningstar and Style Analytics, but it does come in towards the end of our process. So it's more like a sense check rather than a starting point. And obviously we're much more interested in what the fund manager has to say about the company and its future prospects.
And let's talk about greenwashing, which is obviously the big risk in this area. Well, what are the big red flags for you when you speak to managers? I mean, every group and manager says they're integrating ESG and doing this, but are they really? How do you see through what they're saying to you?
Yeah, that's another great question. So I think enthusiasm is really important here. It gives an idea of authenticity. And it's for this reason, I tend to lean more towards companies who have moved their analysts and PMs incorporating ESG with their general research, rather than having a specialist team doing the ESG seal of approval, if you like. And actually, this is where external ratings can come in handy on evidencing integration. We can at least identify some of the stocks that have had issues and ask our managers what they're doing about it. But sorry, Katrina, back to your question. I don't really have that many red flags yet. More green lights, such as the PM ownership of ESG that I just mentioned, and this will include engagement as well. Now, obviously, I do appreciate that larger firms have their own stewardship team, which is great, but I think it sends a stronger message to companies if the PM and someone from stewardship meet the company management together. I guess what I'm trying to say is that the person ultimately deciding whether to hold or sell the company is in the room and pushing for change.
I wanted to ask you as well about which areas you find interesting in terms of product development in this space. I mean, where are the gaps? You're coming from a multi-asset perspective here. What would you like to see in terms of product development going forwards?
Yeah, well, bearing in mind I'm pretty new to this and we're focusing on our non-explicit ESG funds first. I've not really delved into ESG and sustainable funds that much yet, but so far I do think it would be good to have some more products in the EMD and high yield space. And yeah, I appreciate these areas are more challenging due to the nature of the assets and also the availability of data. But I'd say over the last couple of years in particular, there has been a lot of progress across the industry.
And finally, maybe you can highlight a couple of fund groups or funds that you invest in that you think are really excelling in terms of ESG investing. Who's really sort of standing out for you?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned earlier, we're finding some firms that I think are going about integrating ESG in a really holistic manner. So when I've been looking at the mainstream funds, as I said, I'm not yet focusing on pure ESG funds yet. What Schroders have done in the last couple of years has been really great. So they've given a lot of support, tools and training for their investment teams, as well as their internal ESG fund accreditation process, which PMs have to reapply for every year. So a little bit of internal competition. I think that's a really good idea. Hermes has also impressed me. They obviously have their global stewardship business, but I think the collaborative way their ESG team empowers and incentivizes fund managers works really well. And then out of the smaller boutiques, Magedi are really good. I've had several calls with them where they've walked me through their integrated ESG tool. They've also been very transparent with how they're scoring particular companies and also the engagement milestones they're putting in place together with their companies. And then finally, because there's quite a few, I'd like to mention J.O. Hambro as well. So we've got the UK Equity Income Fund and the UK Dynamic Fund, and I've been really impressed with how both teams have prepared for SFDR. And again, lots of transparency on how they came up with their framework and why. Now, I think just to summarise, all of the things about these companies that I mentioned is how they recognise their ESG analysis is not just about risk, but looking for opportunities and ultimately strengthen their case for an investment.
Yeah, and it's interesting what you said. They're identifying some boutiques as well. Obviously, we know that the big asset managers have all these resources to pile behind ESG, and we've seen that happening. But it's interesting to see what the boutiques are doing, maybe being a bit more creative in what they're doing to make sure they meet the requirements. But it's interesting to see some of the innovative solutions they're coming up with as well.
Absolutely.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Jen. Thanks very much for your time and giving us a really good overview of your thoughts and what you've been doing on the team there. Thank you.
Thank you.